Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the lectures of public finance. I am Khurram. Maybe I should introduce myself second time, but that would take a lots of time. We are already very short of time, and it is an asset, as we might have realized after some time. I said time so many times in this last sentence that it might be too much, I think. So I won't say it second time. Okay, so in the last lecture we were discussing, we are actually on the final steps of the public expenditure part, and we are currently in the last lecture we were discussing pension plans, and then we were discussing the health insurance policies that can be implemented by the government, and we were evaluating those health insurance policies as well as the pension plans. Now in the last lecture what we discussed was about specifically about the pension plan, which was in the sense of pay as you go. Now this pay as you go plan is basically that there are no specific assets held separately for the retirees for the retirement fund. What happens is that if I'm getting retired, then the next generation working would be contributing as well as would be paying taxes, and those would be the source of finance of my pension when I get retired. So one generation supports the next generation, and then that generation supports the next generation, and so on. The cycle goes on. So this is a pay as you go pension plan, and this pension plan is applicable in most of the government setups. My contributions actually for the pension that I make during my public sector services or any such sort of service where I'm eligible for pension, in that case the amount being set aside might be utilized to pay for those people who are already retired, and then when I would be at that age, my financial assistance would come from those people who would be working. So during while evaluating the pension plan and the effects of pensions on behaviors of individuals, we discussed it around two broad parameters. One was on the work incentives of the individual, and the other one was on the saving incentive of the individual. Why we are discussing this? Because pensions are a major part of government expenditure that they do, and it is very necessary to evaluate how people would behave in the presence of a pension plan. And because, as I already discussed, specifically when we move towards saving and we discuss saving plan incentives, it is very important for individuals to save and provide funds for investments, because those funds for investment are the source of future investments, and those are the source of efficiency in the system, more production, more capital, more labor, more growth, more job creation. So all the cycle starts with basically the savings, and why when people have money to save. So how pension might affect an individual's behavior to save was discussed on the second in the second part of the lecture, and let me summarize both of them. The first one was basically we evaluated the work incentives of those people who would be receiving pensions, and we discussed two types of cases. One case was then when the individual was subject to earnings test. He was not of the full retirement age, but he had taken an early retirement, so there was still some time period in which he could work. So he would be subject to an earning test specifically in USA. No, that is not applicable in Pakistan, I don't think so, but that would be applicable in USA earning test scenario. So when he would be eligible for pension, those earning tests would stop. So what would happen to his work incentives? There would be income and substitution effect. Income effect in a sense that his income would rise with those government transfers, and while on the other hand there might be a scenario of substitution effect, in which case the individual would be considering in terms of an earning test, the more an individual earns, the amount of transfer payment reduces. So his work and leisure choices are substituted among each other, because if he works a lot, there won't be any transfers to him beyond a certain point. We discussed through a graphical analysis. and that would induce an individual towards increasing his layer time, for example. So basically in this pension plan scenario, for the individuals who were retiring early and who had certain age, for example, left to work to be productive members of the society, how their work incentives are affected by a pension transfer. Those are like substitution effect and income effect. And in terms of income effect, we specifically discussed that an increase in income causes increase in consumption of normal goods by every individual. So that is basically one of laws in economics. So when in fact something related to the law of demand, because demand of normal goods increases with the increase in income also. So if we treat layer as a normal good, so its demand should also increase with increase in income. So that was the income effect. Then we turn on to the individual who was of the retiring age, and he retired at the time of his retirement, and he cannot be bound to work anymore, so he was not subject to earning test. So there was no substitution effect in his case, but there was only an income effect, in which case his increase in income, he would demand more layer time and less work time, and so his incentive to reduce work or disincentive to work actually increases. Then we discussed this effect of transfers in terms of savings incentive towards individual. Based on that, there are three particular effects that might occur in case of any individual. The first one was asset substitution effect. Asset substitution effect is that you consider that government promise of a pension in future as an asset, and then you stop saving, because you know that at the age of retirement you would be getting certain returns from the government. And the second one was that was basically induced retirement effect. That would be that when an individual knows that certain amount is being collected by the government, then he might save more so that he can retire early, or at well in time at the time of retirement, and he does not need to work anymore. So that would be increase in savings in terms of induced retirement effect. Then there was bequest effect, and that was in a sense that bequest effect is that when an individual is retiring, and when an individual thinks of his future generations like his children or his grandchildren, so he wants to give them a lump sum or more benefits after retirement. So that is why he intends to save and give them a substantial amount of inheritance maybe. So that is the bequest effect. So one of the effects, which is asset substitution effect, reduces an individual's incentive to save, while the two other effects, the bequest effect and induced retirement effect, might push an individual towards saving and give him more incentives to save. So these are like behavioral factors, and they might differ for each and every individual. You can generalize these are not like laws of physics that for every action there is equal and opposite reaction, or law of inertia or something like that, or law of gravity maybe. Now it is these laws in terms of social sciences turn out to be very close approximations of what happens actually, but they are not applicable to each and every individual. So in terms of, for example, work incentives, we specifically discussed that if an individual's preference for layer is greater, then that income effect would cause him to more layer time. But then there are always individuals who are like sort of workaholics, and they like to keep working, and even if the amount of transfer in times of earning test, or even if times when he is full retirement, he is not subject to earning test, he would be working full time so that he can keep himself busy. So these principles and theories like asset substitution effect or induced retirement effect or bequest effect are not for you can say generalized law, but they are the basic norms through which after they are made basically through empirical analysis and questionnaire surveys, and these might be one of the few guiding principles that might guide an individual, and each single individual might be affected by a combination of these. So you cannot generalize them that easily. So then we discussed the economic analysis of how asset substitution effect takes place, and in that case we discussed a scenario in which the tax imparted by the government or a contribution demanded by the government was more than an individual's savings, and in that case individual was not better off. But if it was less than the individual savings, individual would substitute that amount of saving for the government saving that they would give them return in the retirement age, and some part of it that is left out of it he would save himself. So in other words, he has substituted the government's saved amount or government's promise as a saved asset, and he has substituted it with his own savings, and that seems very practical in a scenario or two, and that seems very logical because in that case if there is a government induced sort of savings in terms of future promises of pension, and they are taking some part of your income that is mandatory either in the form of a tax or in the form of a mandatory contribution, then automatically you have lesser chunk of income in your hand. And if you are saving for some your retirement age, then automatically you would consider that amount coming back when you get retired, so you won't save that much anymore. In any case, then we moved on to evaluating to the last part, going on to the last part of the last lecture, which was effect of the health insurance, and we discussed that if third parties are the ones who are going to pay for somebody's medical treatment, then that would increase the demand from the patients, because since they are only paying the fraction of this is some sort of coinsurance scheme in which individuals also bear some of the expenses, but usually those expenses are just a fraction of the total expenditure on medical treatment in terms of drugs, in terms of hospital stays, in terms of for example in terms of surgery or any sort of other medical treatment that was required. So if I would only pay a very small fraction of it, then automatically that would be the price at which I would demand that product, and since the price is very low, I would demand more and the quantity would increase. Now since that quantity would increase, that would also increase the supply of in order to increase the supply of the product at that increased quantity, the prices would rise up. So there is a rise in the prices by the suppliers and decrease in prices for the individual who is demanding that quantity, and the result would be individuals would have to pay less while hospitals would be charging more, and the difference would be paid by the third parties, either the government or a private insurance agency or whoever the third party would be. So in that case there would be a whole area that would be paid, and there would be net loss to the society, and that would be sort of an inefficiency in the market mechanism. Now we were discussing social security and social insurance, and in that we were basically discussing the health insurance generically. I guess that would be health insurance would be the main heading of this slide over here, should be, but it is part of a social insurance, so we'll let it continue. So now we would move on to health insurance discussion, and we would end it today inshallah, and then we would move on to government finance, and that would be revenues, taxation, debt finance, inflationary finance. Those would be again some we would be getting out of the government expenditure part. But why we discussed all the government expenditure part in so detail? There are always operational expenditures by the government. There are projects taken up by the government. Maybe they are planning to build a dam, maybe they are planning to build a stadium, maybe they are planning to build a road or highway or something like that, and we discussed that it is very important to evaluate those programs in terms of marginal social cost and marginal social benefits by the government. That was basically cost and benefit analysis. Then we moved on to certain incentives by the government. Those are basically because the government has to support the poor or those who cannot work, or those people who are retired or after the retirement age. So since the government has to support those individuals, then these programs also have implications on the overall economy as well. And we cannot ask the government just to let go of all these programs like Benazir income support program or old age employee old age benefit incentives, and for example death or disability insurance offered by government of Pakistan to its public sector employees, and free medical services offered to its public sector employees. We cannot ask the government to let go of those services all suddenly, but we need to evaluate the consequences of those services that are being borne to that are being borne by rest of the country. So all of this can be actually associated to very conveniently and very easily. And as I said, that there are so many hospitals that provide free treatment to certain medical to certain employees, even in private sector. Many private sector multinational corporations provide full medical treatment to their employees, their spouses, their dependent parents, and all that in Pakistan. So actually, what happens to that sort of a scenario? Why there are very expensive hospitals in Pakistan also, and why the public sector hospitals are providing medical treatment, and what is the cost of that treatment, and who bears that cost, and all that scenario. So this we can associate to that very easily. Now we were discussing basically problems with health insurance. Health insurance might just be the insurance that you go and take from a private sector insurance company, like for example EFU or Pak Qatar or any insurance company, or for maybe there is American insurance also. There are so many insurance companies in Pakistan. So you can go and opt for a health insurance over there. Then you can also go if you are employed in a public sector organization and they are providing health treatment for free in certain designated hospitals. Then in that case you would again be opting for free medical treatment. The same scenario over here that we are discussing. If you are employed in a multinational corporation and they are offering you free medical treatment at like certain big hospitals, even that you would again fall into this scenario. If you are for example an armed services personnel, then they are being offered free medical treatment in their military hospitals, and that is again you would fall in this scenario. So all of us who are eligible for free medical treatment, or if we know somebody who is eligible for free medical treatment, all of them would fall in this scenario. So we need to discuss this, and all of these things are as applicable to Pakistan as they are applicable to any other country. Specifically, while discussing the examples, we had certain cases like Medicaid program, which was by USA, which was for the poor. Health insurance for the poor does have its own effects, but we can associate to this scenario of free medical treatment or medical treatment at cheaper rates while living in Pakistan without any Medicaid facility by the government for the poor also. Now let's move on to what are the problems with health insurance company. The first one is asymmetry of information or asymmetric information. Asymmetric information is certain scenarios that sellers know more about the product rather than the buyers, and because they know more about the product than you, so they can convince you on the aspects of use of that product even if that is not required by you, and that results into overconsumption. So in this case, in health insurance case, the sellers of the medical facility, the healthcare like hospitals and surgeons and medical practitioners know about the complexities of healthcare facilities more than any patient in this who would be coming. So that might lead to overconsumption by them. Then there are adverse selection problems, and there are like 3 or 4 points that we would be discussing under the head of adverse selection. People at greater risk for health expenses will purchase health insurance even at very high premiums. Now for example, if I see that in coming future there would be health problems for me, so I might go to a health insurance provider and I might try to get a health insurance. Now since my medical history is not very good, so health insurance would charge me a higher premium for that. So in that case I would be paying a higher premium than a healthy person who just got the health insurance. I would be paying a higher premium and I would take the insurance because I'm uncertain about my future, and I feel that my health may be at risk and there would be expenses that I cannot bear myself. So that is why I would be opting for that option. Then at those higher premiums, people who are healthy may opt to go without insurance, leading to situation where insurance companies must raise rates. Now because of people like me who are more worried about their health, the insurance companies increases its rates and there are higher premiums. Now an individual who is somewhat healthy would not consider that higher insurance because he would be paying a higher premium for nothing because he thinks that he is healthy. So he would not be taking insurance. Now because the quantity demanded of insurance reduces, to meet up the cost, the insurance companies further raises the premium. premiums. Now you see, because of two reasons, the premium is being raised, and one reason is that I am not healthy and I'm opting for insurance, and since they know that my medical history is not good and they would be spending money on me in near future, so if they give me insurance, they would raise the premiums. Now once they raise the premiums, the cost of insurance would go up. And on the other hand, a healthy individual who should take that insurance and would be beneficial for the insurance company, because he won't be going to hospital that much and he's healthy, and still he would be paying the premium. He won't opt to buy that insurance because the premiums are very high. So in that case, he would opt not to buy it. So that would again reduce the total quantity, because the basic insured individuals would be people like me. So that reduction in quantity to meet up the cost, the insurance company would further raise the premium. So that would be causing a greater increase in insurance premiums, and this problem can create a vicious cycle that drives insurance companies out of business and leaves people without the health insurance. So this adverse selection scenario, because adverse selection on the part of insurance company, because adverse selection is a concept in which you do not select an optimal choice. For example, I can give you an example in terms of banking. For example, if you are giving a loan and you do not choose the party right because of asymmetry of information on both sides, because the individual who's borrowing from the bank knows about the use of those funds that he's borrowing. So he might be convincing the bank that, okay, I'm investing them in this project and that would give me so much revenue, and then I would be easily paying you back. So if there is an adverse selection among them and bank selects an individual who won't be able to pay in the future, so the cost of the loan would go up, and that would mean that would be a scenario of adverse selection. So in this case, the individual with high health risks will purchase health insurance even at high premiums, and he is an adverse selection in terms of the insurance agency. And the individual who's healthy, he is not willing to buy that insurance because he would have been a better choice. So there is an adverse selection problem over here, and it is a vicious cycle, and that might cause insurance agencies to go out of business and leave everyone without insurance. Then there is a problem of third-party payments. Neither the insured individual has to pay for the health treatment, nor the physicians have to pay for the health treatment. So none of them have any incentive to keep the costs down of their medical, or you can say their business transaction among them. I'm calling it a business transaction. When you go to the doctor, you pay for his services. So if you are paying for his services, this is a business transaction between you and the doctor. So if you are not paying for that business transaction, you are only paying a small fraction of it, and the doctor is getting paid by the insurance company, by the third party. So that would mean there is a gap between there, and both of them have no incentive to keep the cost down, because the cost is being borne by the third party. And by the way, that again increases the premiums, and we don't need to discuss that right now. So this leads to overconsumption, because none of them are bothered about the cost, and since I would say I'm insured, I don't care, prescribe me any more tests if you want. So that would be a scenario of overconsumption, and patients evaluate the benefits of a procedure against only the fraction of amount that they are paying against it, their co-insurance rate actually. Now co-insurance rate would be some part of the total expenditure that you might be paying. That in certain cases would be, for example, while in Europe, I used to pay 25 euros every month for medical treatments, for insurance. That was sort of insurance by the government for the students actually, or for people earning not that much, of course. So that was a subsidized insurance scheme, but I was only paying 25 or 24 euros a month. So in that case, if I get admitted in a hospital, they would be spending a lot of money on all the tests that they do, and all the tests, and there are operational expenditures as well. For example, bedding charges and food charges and all that. While getting discharged from the hospital, I only need to pay a part of a fraction of not all the expenditure on me, but only a fraction of the food and the bed charges, and that's all. So it is not much. So if that is not much, then I evaluate the whole whole medical facility that I enjoyed while my that I had a benefit from while my stay at the hospital, then that whole medical service would be evaluated only at the fraction of payment that I have made, like for example maybe 20 euros for 2 days or less than that. So that would be the case. In this case I would be evaluating that product based on the amount that I am paying. So that would again lead to for example increased demand, because I am evaluating a very good quality product just on the amount that I am paying for it. So I might increase my consumption for that product. Then there is a problem of moral hazard. People with insurance often behave in ways that cause them to need the insurance, for example, because there is a statement like among young people, they would say if their parents are in public sector or armed forces or some place like where their medical is free, they would like take unnecessary risks, and they would say that it doesn't matter, medical is free anyway. So that is a type of a moral hazard, because people would take unnecessary risk if they know that they have health insurance and anything happens to them, the insurance company would be bearing all the expenditure, or any third party like the government or some other institution, and that would result into people might fail to eat right and exercise well and keep themselves healthy, and that would again be depending on the health insurance. If an individual has to bear the actual cost of even minor of such minor injuries, or for example minor health problems, then he would be careful for his health, and he would be careful that because he cannot afford it, it's much better that he does not have to bear that cost. So that would again these things would again might result into increasing the cost of insurance. Then there are other features also that contribute towards inefficiency and high cost in terms of medical services. Now first would be the malpractice insurance. Now malpractice insurance is whenever there is a mistake by doctors in terms of any medical treatment, the other individual might go and sue him in the court for and declare that was negligence or malpractice, and this individual did not treat me well, and that's why I resulted into for example this disability or this disease or something like that. An individual might go to hospital and get an infectious disease from there, and then he would blame the hospital and go to the court and sue them for that disease. Or maybe if a surgeon is doing a surgery and there is some complication during that process, then again that individual would go and sue that surgeon surgeon from the hospital in the terms of malpractice. So the doctor also are insured for malpractice insurance, and in that case their insurance company, in case of any lawsuit, if he is liable to pay, then that insurance company would back him up. But then those insurance premium for such malpractice insurance are again very high. So these costs are again passed on to the health insurance companies, and then on the patients in the form of higher insurance premium on the patients. So this is again a vicious cycle of increased premiums on the insurance companies, from the insurance companies. Then there are uninsured patients also. Because of lack of general insurance, health insurance in Pakistan, other than for public sector employees or other than for individuals listed in certain, you can say, employed in certain multinationals who would be eligible for cheaper medical facilities. There are cases in for example, developed countries or industrialized countries who have generic insurance policies for the poor specifically. So when there are uninsured patients, then on the moral grounds, when they enter a hospital, they are required to be treated. But since they cannot afford that treatment, what happens is that they are often, might be the case that they are billed in terms of some other individual's insurance number, under some other individual's insurance number, because that individual cannot pay out of his own pocket, and the doctor cannot or the hospital cannot bear the expense of that treatment. So they put that expense on the insurance company. It is again debatable on moral grounds of whether they would choose not to treat that patient and let him die, or maybe treat him and then again follow some other unethical practice of giving them putting his name under some other insurance policy which he's not eligible for. But then there is a big dilemma of morals everywhere. Then another thing that might result into inefficiency and high cost in terms of medical services is basically the technological advancements and third-party payments and overconsumption. Third-party payments result into overconsumption of medical services, and this overconsumption of medical services result into more resource allocation in health services sector, and that more resource allocation in health service sector results into technological advancements in that sector, and certain technological advancements are done that even might not be necessary, and they would again increase the cost of the insurance, but still cost of medical services. And so in the end we discussed that the increase in the cost of medical services may be due to health insurance or co-insurance or malpractice insurance or uninsured patients or technological advancements, and all these are the result of third-party payments through the insurance companies or through the government, and subsidized payments because patients regularly demand those services because they have to pay only fraction of it, and since hospitals know that these patients are not going to pay for it, the burden is being borne by either the company in the private sector or the government or the insurance company. So they, as we discussed earlier, that they prescribe more tests, and they are they might admit the patient for an indoor medical treatment and all that, just considering the scenario that he's not going to pay for it, and the third party is going to pay for it, and third party bears all the burden of it, and that all results into increase in the cost of medical services. Now, why worry about growth in healthcare costs? An increasing share of income is devoted to healthcare, which employees' other priorities lose out. Health insurance costs for employers cause them to hire contract labor. Employees with poor health history can be inefficiently locked into a particular job. Now, all these three aspects are very important, that why we are having a whole debate, because health insurance and health expenditures are one of the very major part of the government expenditure. And you always would be hearing that whenever there is a budget announcements by the government, people and international agencies mostly ask the question, what is the percentage of expenditure for education, what is the percentage of expenditure for health, what is the percentage of expenditure on defense. Like, these are the few major heads people worry about, and health and education and pollution are for like the development of the society at large, and health and education basically are so important that on the basis of education you are producing a skilled labor force that is going to be contributing a lot in economic growth, and on health grounds you are producing a healthy labor force which would again be producing contributing substantially in terms of economic growth. When we study the growth of a country in terms of development, or even in terms of human development index that I discussed earlier, there is health indicators also in that. There are education indicators, health indicators and poverty indicators, and that actually represents income, health and education. So income would be per capita GDP or distribution of income, or how many poor are living in the society. Health would be how many individuals have access to health services over there, and what is the life expectancy of birth, what is at the time of birth, and what is mortality rate, what is infant mortality rate, what is the mortality rate of children under the age of 5 years, and all these indicators and some weighted form of them are used to calculate the human development index. Then there is education, how many what is like access to that education, how many children are enrolled in primary school, secondary school, and how many expenditure being done on the education in terms of. So the government expenditure basically defines all these variables. When government is spending money on health services, then that is going to come out in terms of of a healthy and better living society, more which can contribute better towards, which can be better economic agents, in fact. So if the government is contributing so much towards health and provision of that health, then there is then we need to worry about that what is the cost of that health services, why they are increasing, and what are the effects of those governments incentives in the economy. Now it is on one hand, I have discussed and highlighted that there is no way out of it. The government has to take care of these health services being provided, and improvement of health is one of the prime objectives. And you can see the issue and debate of, for example, polio vaccination in Pakistan. There are countries who have been successful in completely eradicating polio virus from their countries. But in case of Pakistan, we are still trying to do that, and that is a huge expense by the government. But just look at it, what happens to whenever any Pakistani individual leaving the airport. I know about certain countries, but maybe it is for all the countries, leaving Pakistani airport, they have to be vaccinated for polio. Now this all represents that on the international global community scale, we are just being criticized on the part of not being successfully able to eradicate polio from our society yet. So now you see the importance of government decisions and the importance of government expenditure on healthcare services, and that is why there are massive movements across the country for polio eradication, and polio drops are given by social workers across the country to every children that they can put their hands on. So you see, that part of government expenditure has not just repercussions for the society, but they have global repercussions. If we had been successful in eliminating polio long time ago, the international embarrassment of any individual going out of Pakistan being vaccinated for polio would not have been there right now. So how international community looks at us also matters in terms of health and education and income. So that is why these things are to be taken up by the government, because no private institution, for example, polio vaccination is a public good that is to be taken up by the government. No private institution would have any incentives to take up that, because government is not only targeting the individuals who can pay for polio vaccines, but also those individuals who might not be able to pay for the polio vaccinations. So in fact, most of them cannot pay for the regular polio vaccinations, so or polio drops, you can say. So the whole debate comes along that it is a public good, so no private sector entity, profit maximizing entity, would have an incentive to take up this whole activity on behalf of the government. So the importance of these actions by the government is highlighted, but then these actions also have their own costs, and that would be one of the costs that we have been discussing so many costs along this lecture, but now we will be discussing one of the costs, and that one is specifically that such actions by the government might result into increased cost of medical services across the board. And why we are worried about, again going back to this slide, that why worry about growth in healthcare costs. An increasing share of income is devoted to healthcare, which implies other priorities lose out, because there is more demand of healthcare services because of insurance or because of free medical treatment scenario. So there are more resources, as I discussed, more resources are being put into this area. More individuals are becoming doctors just because it might be, apart from their own compassionate feelings, some of them might become doctors because of the economic incentive out of it. So more capital, more labor being employed in this area, and that would mean that every expenditure has its own opportunity cost. So that fund might have been devoted to establishing more schools, or maybe establishing a scientific institution, or maybe establishing any other business entity. So those resources are coming over here because the costs are rising and returns are getting fatter and fatter, in other words. So health insurance cost for employers cause them to hire contract employees, like whenever, specifically in case of government of Pakistan, when they hire an individual on permanent basis, they term them as permanent employee, they have to give them medical facilities, in a sense. They have to give them complete medical treatment to them, their spouses, their children, and their dependent parents. So this is like some of the one of the you can say laws in terms of permanent government employment. Now, in that case, they need to consider the cost of hiring an employee. Even private sector organizations might also consider that if we hire an individual, then we would be bearing for his expenses and permanently if they hire a permanent individual, on permanent contract basis. So then what they would do, that in order to reduce those costs, they hire maybe individuals on contract basis, and on contract basis an individual, you just pay them lump sum amount that includes, you say that the medical treatment is included in this. So whenever there is a medical expenditure, you do go and spend that amount yourself. I'm not sure about the government contract employment, maybe that includes medical or not, but generally the purpose of hiring contract employees is that there is a cost of hiring a permanent employee which we cannot remove very easily. So when you hire them on a contract, you pay them a lump sum amount in terms of medical treatment also. So employees with poor health history can be inefficiently locked into a particular job because of certain medical treatments by, as I said, that free medical treatment to government employees or to military personnel and to other private sector entities. So if that individual is not healthy, he might be locked into that job just because that organization is bearing his health expenditure. So that would again result into an increase in cost and decrease in efficiency generically. Now then, what would be the impact of coinsurance on price of health care? For example, low coinsurance rates cause patients to ignore healthcare cost. Again, as I discussed, that what is coinsurance rate? Coinsurance rate would be that if I am insured by, for example, any private sector insurance company, there is a certain amount, certain fraction of the payment that I have to make myself, as I gave an example of that 25 euro insurance in government insurance provided to students over there. So they have a very low co-insurance rate because only a fraction of the total expenditure I have to pay myself, and that again, as I discussed, that you evaluate the total service based on the amount that goes out of your pocket, because that is the price you are paying for it. You do not look at the whole expenditure being borne by the insurance company or by the government. So low co-insurance rates cause patients to ignore healthcare costs because they don't bear the cost out of their own pockets, and then this increased demand and this increases the demand and encourages an inefficiently high level of consumption. We discussed that in so many graphs previously, and we would have one more for that, that there are inefficiencies in the system because of the third parties bearing a huge part of your total income. This is a similar graph which we discussed earlier. Let me explain this graph once more. On the x-axis there are healthcare services per year, the quantity demanded of healthcare services per year. On the y-axis there is price in dollars per unit of the service. Now we had a similar graph where the demand curve was the marginal social benefit curve and the supply curve was marginal social cost curve, and in that graph the equilibrium quantity was defined, and we saw that because of insurance, actually the third party payments, for example, if I am insured and I go to the hospital for medical treatment, because of this the total quantity demanded has increased from for example from the equilibrium point to Q1 represented by the line AB. Now that quantity Q1 is demanded extra because I only pay a small amount for it, and as the price goes down I demand more for it. So price is dependent shown on the demand curve at point B. The price is P1, I only have to bear that, and at that P1 price I demand the quantity Q1. Now in order to meet up that quantity demanded, the hospitals need to hire more resources to provide that quantity, to make that quantity available. The production increases, in other words, and that results into increase in for example the cost of production, and at the higher quantity would be supplied at a higher prices, which is represented by P4 over here. So I pay only the fraction of the amount P1 while the hospitals receive the full amount P4. So where does the difference go? P4, A, B and P1, that square is basically paid by the third party, which is maybe the government government or maybe the insurance or anybody, insurance company or the private company. So those would be paid by the third party. And in terms of benefit and loss, area A is above area B, so marginal social cost is above marginal social benefit. So that would automatically mean that, I hope you know what that means, there is net loss to the society. So the triangle AEB actually represents the net loss to the society. Now, what is proposed in this scenario over here is how an increase in co-insurance can reduce healthcare spending and improve efficiency in the market for healthcare services. What they have done over here is that since, let's assume that previously I only had to pay 5% of the total total medical expenditure on me, and rest of the 95% was borne by either the insurance company or by the government or by the private company which I am working for. So in that case, the line moved on. The line is moved from equilibrium point, whose quantity is not shown over here, to Q1. So if you increase that co-insurance rate, maybe by 20 or 30%, from 5% to 25 or 30%, then that would mean that out of whenever the total expenditure is incurred, I would be paying a much larger chunk of it. So if, for example, the total expenditure on me was 100 rupees, previously I was paying 5 rupees and 95 rupees were being paid by the insurance company or the government. Now in this case, in the second case, I am proposing, or the slide is proposing, that only maybe assuming 30% should be paid by as a co-insurance rate. The co-insurance rate should be 30%. So in this case, when I go to the hospital, there is an expenditure of 100 rupees on me, so I would be paying 30 rupees and 70 rupees would be paid by the insurance company or the third party. So you see, at first I was evaluating the same service at 5 rupees, and now I would be evaluating the same service at 30 rupees. So there is a huge difference in the mindset. So that would cause an increase in payments out of my pocket, would actually put me in front of the increased cost of medical services, because previously I was being shielded out of it because of the third party payments, and I did not, I never had to bear that cost or see that cost as such. So over there in Austria, by the end, I would say, just like to add over here this, that over there actually they send you a letter, the insurance company sends you a letter every year, and they say that across this year you have incurred this and this and this type of medical service, and now you have to, the total expenditure borne by us was this much, and the total expenditure borne by you was this much. They would actually send you a whole detail of expenditure that was incurred on you, just to show you that how much expenditure has been incurred on you, and so what is the actual cost of healthcare facility, maybe to make you obliged. And but that I like that scenario actually. When looking at this graph, it should happen whenever there is a government employee or any private entity spending money on you in terms of health insurance. They should send you in very often cases they make you pay a fraction of amount, but they never tell you about that actual expenditure, and they should do that this is the amount that we spent on you for your medical treatment. Anyway, in this graph we are discussing that if we increase the co-insurance rate to maybe from 5% to 30% as an example, the quantity demanded would reduce, and quantity demanded would come to Q star, for example, in this graph, and at point the price that I would be facing would increase from P1 to P2 on the demand curve that is represented by B prime. So the price would move upwards, and it would increase from P1 to P2, and the point on the demand curve would move from B to B slash. So that would represent that the quantity demanded has reduced. Now since the quantity demanded has reduced, the quantity supplied would also reduce, and that is represented by the points on the supply curve A and A slash. So previously the quantity supplied was Q1, and the point was A, and the price was P4, but then with decrease in quantity being supplied, that would be movement from point A to A slash, and the price would automatically reduce to P3, and the new quantity would be Q star. So the only difference over here is the efficient outcome or the net weight efficiency in the market of healthcare services, and the implication is that the net loss to the society, or net loss in this case, which we saw previously in last lecture, I guess, the whole area AEB was net loss, which has only now reduced to A/B/ and E. So the net loss has reduced to the society. And with this last graph, and I hope I have been successfully able to explain the impact of government expenditure and various activities of the government on the economy, and actually that affects us all. So it is an important part of public finance that we need to see, and various expenditures of the government in terms of the projects, or in terms of taking care of the poor or elderly, or pensions, or medical treatments, or for example education, and or their effects on market efficiency, their effects on saving behavior. So all these examples and all the discussion that we had was revolving around the role of the government in the economy. Those roles are no doubt very important. The projects taken up by the government for building roads and constructing dams and bridges and providing infrastructure to the private sector, these are again similar, because poverty increases. Let's assume, if we consider only the role of government for the poverty stricken individual, then that increases their the risk of social unrest in the economy. And if what would be an ideal economic environment in which a private business entity, a multinational, would like to invest. Now that would be an environment if the government facilities are ideal, the infrastructure is well organized and planned, and the labor force that they are intending to hire is healthy, educated, and they have strong ethical values, strong moral values. So the overall business environment is good and free of corruption and all that. So these are the responsibilities of the government, and providing healthy and educated labor force is again the responsibility of the government, and are basically the effects of policies of the government that have been applied on the economy over a long period of time. And those policies have their effects, and those effects were discussed, and alternate means were discussed, and we evaluated the whole government expenditure part in a very we looked at it, or we actually looked on the other side of the picture, and we evaluated them in a very different way. Normally whenever we have a discussion with some individual about the expenditures of the government, we do not actually know that what type of expenditure is going to hit where in the economy, and who would be bearing the cost and who would be bearing the benefits. And all of us are taxpayers, and we need to see the outcome of the tax being paid by us. So that outcomes comes in terms of various government projects taken up by the government. So what we discussed over here was of very critical importance for you, and for considering you guys as future public administrators and future policy makers. And so it would be very important that you grasp a hold of this scenario, that what is the importance of the expenditure of the government, and it not only affects that one point in time. Those effects are across the generations, and those effects, either negative or positive, might be affecting not one or two or three individuals, but the populations at large. Just like the example of Benazir income support program, or employee old wage benefit institutions activities, or zakat fund, or for example Baitul Mal, and all there, or maybe from private sector like Abdul Sattar Eidi's activities. So all these activities do have strong economic repercussions also, and you need to consider them while making policies, and you need to consider their effects on the efficiencies, and how much deadweight loss is created, or and what would be the alternate means of taking up the same objective with some other policy, so that the outcomes are much better. Still we have some time, so we would start the basic introduction to the government finance. Governments actually they are very versatile organisms sort of things, because they need to be fed to operate. So if the main thing is that whenever all the expenditures that we have discussed, they need to build roads, dams, and they need to build bridges, and they need to finance the national defense also. They need to provide education and healthcare facilities, and whenever something like this goes wrong, we say, where is the government? Whenever there is a national catastrophe, for example floods, or for example earthquakes, who is the first agency or entity that moves in to help those people or provide support? Now that is basically the whole machinery of the government, which is responsible for all those activities. Just consider the role of, for example, the rescue department that has been created in Pakistan, in terms of provision of ambulance, and in terms of provision of fire and safety, and in terms of provision of security, for example to the military or the police services. So all these services are not free of cost, and those are public goods. And do you think that anybody who's like perfectly all right now would pay for ambulance, that whenever I need an ambulance it would be there, so I pay, for example, 1,000 rupees every month, or maybe 1,000 rupees every month, that in case there is a fire, the fire safety staff would come and protect me from the fire? Nobody would pay for that directly or voluntarily. And that was the debate in the start as a whole, that in a voluntarily scenario, people would be paying for the public goods, but then there is a risk that when the economies, when the communities get larger and larger, and they become cities and provinces and countries, it is very difficult to make sure that each and every individual would pay as per their marginal benefit, at least being sincere. And there would be the problem of free riders also. Even in terms of tax, for example, we discussed the scenario of tax evasion also. So that is again a very interesting, yeah. So even in terms of tax, we discussed that there is tax evasion. So what if in terms of, for example, voluntary payments, who would pay for those, all those public goods? So all that expenditure by the government needs to be financed somehow. They need to bear the expenditure of this time period, or for example this financial year, and they need to plan for the next financial year also. So those finances do not accumulate from, for example, Pakistan Railways tickets, or for example public parks created by the government, or zoos created by the government, and the tickets and tolls on the motorway. They are not the only source of the government revenue. There might be, for example, taxation also. There is taxation also, in fact. Then through taxation they try to generate revenue. Taxation can be direct taxation or indirect taxation also. We would get into that debate later on, which type of taxes are much better for an economy, and where Pakistan lies. But that is going to, like, almost end of this course where we would be discussing Pakistan. But the whole scenario is over here is that it is very important to keep that machinery of the government running, to provide them with revenue, so that that machinery provides us the most possible efficient outcome, which is responsible for the future earnings also, because that infrastructure that they establish, the motorways that they build, the national defense that they provide, the security and safe environment that they create, the less polluted environment they create, the educated and healthy labor force that they create, are not required for just that one time period when that government is operating. That those are required for the longer term generations also. Those are required for maybe 15, 20, 30 years, and they would have, all those actions would have repercussions for that also. So if you study the policies historically, the perspective of Pakistan from the day of its independence to, for example, decisions of President Ayub or decisions of President Bhutto, Prime Minister Bhutto, or decisions of President Zia, and decisions of General Pervez Musharraf, President Pervez Musharraf, decisions of Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto or Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, or even the decisions of the interim governments that are created at the time of elections. All these decisions have very strong and long-lasting repercussions for the economy, and it is possible that the seeds sown in one government's era might be giving fruit or giving fruit in the next era. So then all these governments have to battle with the international community's perspective also, that what type of policies you are taking up for poverty eradication or defense or education. So you have to manage your relationships with all the international community also. So all that infrastructure, all that machinery running continuously needs fuel, and that fuel is in terms of revenue, and that revenue is required to be generated through individuals, their incomes, through corporations, their incomes, through trade incomes, through tariffs and for example licenses, and through tolls on the motorways, or through fees on the parks. So all these things accumulate together, and they gather into the government's infrastructure for future. So while starting with this, like there are federal, state and local governments. We would be discussing the detail of these when we would be discussing Pakistan. We are actually discussing the general theory right now, as we discuss the theory in terms of government expenditure or in terms of voting. Now we are discussing the theoretical perspective of the government itself, and then its sources of revenue, and then later on when we would come to Pakistan, we would take this specifically to Pakistan also. I have been trying to giving you examples on a local context also, but when we end this part, the revenue part, we would be jumping to Pakistan inshallah, where we would be discussing the details of federal, state and local government. All those governments have their different sources of revenue, they have their jurisdictions, and that revenue is accumulated either at the local level or at province level or at federal level, and then the whole amount is distributed across provinces or across local governments, and then they do certain types of expenditures which are again their jurisdiction. Certain types of expenditure can be taken up by the governments, and certain types of expenditures cannot be taken up by the local government. For example, the local government in maybe Faisalabad cannot start a plan to build a motorway, for example, that is, or an airport, for example. So those are the mandates of the federal government or the province. So whenever there is an announcement of budget by the government of Pakistan, there is the national budget and there is provisional budget allocations announcements also. So all of them are very important, and they have their important role, and there are complications among them, but then such competition and complications can be healthy and can have negative repercussions. So basically taxes are the main source of revenue for the government. Direct or indirect taxes are main source of revenue. Taxes are user charges for government provided services. Government provides services not in terms only in terms of for example national in terms of for example postal service or healthcare service. They also provide the national defense, they also provide pollution free environment, they build parks, they build roads, they build dams, they provide infrastructure for you. So we are all of those all of us are users of those services, and as we discussed that these some of the public sector services are price non-excludable. So that would mean if I do not pay, I can still enjoy national defense, I can still enjoy clean air, I can still enjoy a park being built by the government. So if I do not pay tax for that, tax for the road that is moving from my home to this camera, for example, if I do not pay the road tax, that would mean that that thing is not price is price non-excludable, not price excludable in other words. So because I can use that road even if I do not pay for it. So all to bear all that expenditure, there are taxes, and taxes are actually user charges of all the government services that are being provided. That includes the services like national defense, which we do not see every day. every day, in a sense that we do not consider it every day, in fact. Now, fundamental difference between government and market provided goods and services. What is the difference basically? As I discussed earlier, basically there is, if we consider the example, public sector production process is almost similar. For example, to provide national defense, they have a production function, they hire capital, they hire labor, they enter into contracts with the labor and contracts with the capital, and the process is same, but the final outcome might be different in terms of public provided goods. For example, when government services and goods are provided, they cannot always be packaged and sold to each individual for a unit price. For example, in an example of a national defense or police services, or for example government provided health services, it is very difficult to package and sell those products for the government. It might be easy for health services, but not at least for police services or fire services, or for example fire prevention services, in other words, or national defense, so, or judiciary maybe. So there is very difficult to put a price tag on that. So another big difference between government and market outcomes is that whenever the government sells goods and services, they do not go into market and there is not an immediate cash transaction between the government and the user of that service. Those cash transactions are later on in terms of taxes. So for if I buy a laptop, for example, I go and pay for that laptop, and I pay a price for that laptop. So that price actually rations the quantity that I purchase. If you buy a laptop and I cannot afford a laptop, I do not buy that laptop. So that would mean that, or even a mobile. So that would mean that the price has rationed the quantity that is available in the market. Higher prices would reduce the quantity, and lower prices would increase the quantity. But in this case, in terms of government services, taxes do not ration the goods that are being provided, because there is no immediate payment of taxes. You do not see that this is the amount of tax that I pay for national defense. So the taxes do not actually, are not the, and secondly, they are not treated as prerequisite for enjoying that payment, enjoying that government service. I enjoy national defense every day, but I do not consider every day that I pay tax for that also. But then I enjoy it, and sometimes I ignore that consideration. So, and I do not treat tax as a prerequisite of enjoying a government service of that sort. I might be, for example, if there is a health emergency, or if there is a fire emergency, or if there is a requirement of police or judiciary or national defense, in that case I would be treating myself, or any individual would be treating him or herself liable for that. It would be their right for getting that service, but they do not consider the tax as a prereq for getting that facility. For example, an individual would go to a police station to file a complaint, and then the police might ask that show me your tax return that you filed last time. If you have paid tax, then we would entertain your requirement, otherwise we would not. Just imagine that scenario. So it is very difficult for the government, because the payments are not immediate, and but the services are financed by the taxes. That police services financed by the taxes that we pay actually. Their salaries are based on our tax revenue, that our taxes, that is revenue to the government and payment to him as a salary. So the point is that exists, but that link is missing. We do not see that unless we have to go and pay for that service immediately. That link is missing over here. So if we purchase a good, if we buy a carton of milk or a box of a juice, for example, we go and pay for it. Now the link is immediately over there, but in terms of government services, that link is not over there. So we do not see taxes as a prereq for getting that service. So this is an important fundamental difference between operations of the government and operations of the private sector, and both of them are there to serve the masses. Private sector is also providing goods and services against taxes, against certain prices, and the public sector is also providing goods and services against certain prices, and prices in terms of taxes. But no doubt they are not as much as the value of that service, but still what would be the sources of taxes for government revenue? Basically, number one would be taxes. There are payroll taxes, there are income taxes on corporate and personal. Income taxes would be the income that corporations and individuals have, and they are taxed. Payroll taxes are basically taxes that are deducted from our salary. Then there are property taxes, the property that we own, we pay taxes against them. Then there are sales and excise duties. Then there are estate taxes. Then there are tariffs. So these are the types of various sources, types of taxes that are collected by the government as sources of their revenue. Then there are fees, and for example, license fee for a motor vehicle, or fee for having a television set at your home, or different sorts of fees. Then there are tolls also. Then there are tuition fees also of public institutions. They also charge some amount of tuition fee for each student, and that is again a source of revenue. So then for example, tolls on the motorway would be also a fee. For example, an individual gets an import license, an export license. First he pays a fees for renewal of that license or getting that license, and then he would be paying taxes also while he exports and imports. So this whole scenario would be basically the total government revenue, various sources through which government accumulates its revenue. I guess we are a little bit off our time, so we would continue this interesting part later on. First, we would be in the next lecture we would be evaluating taxes and their effects, and what type of tax would have what type of effect, and then we would be evaluating the other sources of revenue, and we'll move on to that. So it would be useful if I can summarize this lecture once from the start. Just to imprint that stuff on your mind, as I usually say. In this lecture we started with we basically ended the topic of government expenditure, and we are closing the box with health and discussion on health insurance, and that is where we started. What were the problems of health? And in the last lecture we had certain analysis of health insurance, and in the end we would be having another analysis of health insurance, on which we conclude we have certain conclusions. We would discuss that. Now we started with the asymmetric information, then with adverse selection, and then with moral hazard. Asymmetric information is that the health service providers have better information than those individuals who are acquiring the benefits from that service, or the patients. So there might be some excess use out of health services. Then there is a problem adverse selection, because health insurance companies, in case of health insurance companies, because individuals with high risk of health tend to get insurance because they foresee certain expenditure being borne on them in the future, and that is the reason they go for, and the premiums go up. And since the premiums go up, the individuals who are healthier do not get insurance because the premiums are very high, and that is a problem of adverse selection, and actually that is a vicious cycle where the cost of insurance increases. And then there is the concept of third party payments, because the payments are made by the third party, and neither the hospital nor the individual is paying for the medical service, and they individual is only paying a fraction of it, and hospital is just getting the full amount. So both of them do not have any incentive to keep the cost low, so that leads to overconsumption. And this is where we highlighted that individual only evaluates that service on basis of the fraction of the small amount that he is paying. So he is evaluating the quantity based on the amount he is paying, so that is why the quantity increases. Then there is moral hazard. Moral hazard in a sense that individuals who have insurance tend to behave, you can say, maybe irresponsibly, because they know that there is certain third party who's going to bear their expenses in times of sickness, or in case of an accident, and they do not, for example, exercise and eat well just because they are medically insured. So that again increases the cost also, because Then there is another reasons for increase in cost would be malpractice insurance by the doctors, which is that in case something goes wrong, there are higher premiums for that type of insurance, and that company, if there is a lawsuit, then that company bears the expenses of the doctors if he has to pay the patient. So the premiums are high, and when those premiums are high, that again causes an increase in premiums on the patients, and then that again causes generically higher premiums and increase in cost of medical services. Then there are uninsured patients. If in certain cases doctor would be treating an uninsured patient who cannot pay for his own medical services, then that cost is to be borne by, for example, indirectly through some other patient or unofficially through some other patient, and that would be again causing an increase in insurance premiums. And then there are technological advancement, because too much resources are being devoted to the health sector, so that has increased, that has resulted into technological advancements which might be unnecessary in some cases. Then why we need to worry about this is that an increasing share of income is devoted to healthcare, which implies that other priorities lose out. So there is an opportunity cost of all those funds that are being dedicated to health insurance, and high cost of insurance, for example, may cause companies to hire contract employees so that they do not have to pay their insurance cost or their medical treatment cost, and employees with poor health history can be inefficiently locked into their jobs. Then we also discussed that low co-insurance rates cause patients to ignore health cost. The co-insurance rate is basically the fraction of amount that you pay for your treatment, and this increases demand and encourages an inefficiently high level of consumption. And we discussed that in a graph specifically. We discussed that if we increase the co-insurance rate, the loss to the society, the loss in the benefit would reduce from the whole area EAB to a smaller area EA/ and B/, because in this case, if the co-insurance rates are high, the individual would be paying a larger amount out of his own pocket, and then he would evaluate the health services in terms of the amount that he is paying, the greater amount, and that would again reduce his demand, and since the demand would reduce, the supply would need to be reduced also, so the costs or prices would overall come down, and the inefficiency or the net loss to the society would also be reduced. Then we came to the topic of government finance, where I just started with the topic of government finance. We had closed the topic of government expenditure, and it was an important area which we closed today, and then we opened up another box, which was like government sources of revenue and how governments operate, and we would be evaluating the various effects of various sorts of government revenues on the economy's efficiency also. Then we said that taxes are the user charges for the government services. Now government services, why they are different from services in the market? Because markets are immediately products are immediately priced, and the price is basically the signal rationing tool, so that it rations the quantity that is being available in the market and who buys and who does not. But in case of government, the services are provided, but then the price of those services might be taxes that are collected later on. Government operates a whole across periods, and taxes are collected on they do not reflect, you actually do not find the link between the two, because when I go and buy a product out of cash counter and I pay for that product immediately, then I see the link over there. But when the links are not established, then people do not consider, and secondly, the taxes are not the prereq for getting a government service, so that link is missing over there, and the taxes do not ration the quantity of goods and services by the government. Then we highlighted the various sources of government revenue, which are taxes, payroll tax, income tax, property tax, sales tax, and estate and tariff taxes. And then we also discussed that there are tuition fees and license fees and tolls maybe, and just general fees for the government services. We would be taking this on further in the next lectures, so I hope to see you soon. Take care. Allah Hafiz.